Chairing this session is Professor C. Mohan, Director ISAS NUS. I'll now hand the floor to Professor Mohan.
Thank you, Chahab. As you all heard, a very uncommon prospect of concerns in Pakistan. It's really wonderful to hear such a stimulating, very different perception and analysis of what goes on. Part of the problem, I think, in understanding Pakistan, a country like India, which is locked in a conflict, a country like India, which is locked in a conflict with Pakistan, rarely finds the ability to distance itself from the conflict and study Pakistan for Pakistan. It's Pakistan in its own rhythm, in its own internal logic, because the conflict blinds India from fully seeing the domestic politics of Pakistan for many objective perspectives. The West, because of its instrumental approach to Pakistan, never has really time. I think it's use and misuse. I mean, I think episodic, periodic, intense, but episodic engagement marked by complete conflict. So there again, I think the funding agencies in the West have largely focused on the nuclear issue, escalation, de-escalation, all that stuff about the nuclear question, the Kashmir question. So therefore, but there's no real attempt, I think, even in the West and the US, where there's so much interest in Pakistan, but it's really limited to very narrow range of issues. And in China, of course, which is a huge partner for Pakistan today, I doubt it. It's only recent years that the Chinese have actually set up Pakistan Studies Institutes in the leading universities. So for them too, it's largely strategic rather than an attempt at understanding Pakistan. So therefore, I think it's been a very useful for many of us, I think, to correct our own biases and understandings through a very stimulating presentation. I think one thing Dr. Akhtar mentions in the book is, as he told you, he was not going to be in the army. He's also not dealt with the United States or the outside world. That how much of that was a player in this. But quite interesting that you talk about the Zia period. Actually, there's a period when Afghanistan happens. There's a period when the US decides to mobilize radical Islam against the Soviet Union. There's a period when the conservative Islamic groups in the Middle East prevail over the radical secular nationalists, like the Taif summit, where actually the conservative sheikhs prevail over the suited Arab nationalists. So therefore, I think there is an interesting conjunction, we say, the international interest and the domestic politics. And I think Zia's genius was really in combining both, of getting that immunity for what it was. But that's the context. So I think we need to some extent, because the discussion is not just limited to the broader understanding of Pakistan. So, some sense we need to understand what the international dynamic, how that shaped the politics of Pakistan and how Pakistan today deals with the outside world. So, I'm going to take the liberty of changing the sequence of speakers. I'm going to first ask Rajesh to speak, and then possibly come back to look at some of the issues that were raised by him, as well as how he sees the architecture. Because the last chapter of the book, the epilogue, is really about, can Pakistan change? Because he's saying last 40 years, there are interesting changes. So change is inevitable, I think, in every country, every society. Change is inevitable. What would be the terms and conditions under which the change would take place? Or what could be the external and internal factors that would produce a new dynamic in the near future? It's often said change happens not because of revolution, but when elite consensus breaks down. That it's almost quarrels among the elite for the spoils of power that produces change rather than popular people's struggles. But of course, people at the gates produce differences within the elite of how to deal with the masses. But it is the breakdown of the elite consensus of how to deal with the new set of challenges that is actually produces structural change. And that's one theory at least. So I think it's important, to understand that based on his study of the logic of change and the structure of accommodation that took place by the what do you call the historic coalition that can actually bring together people of that the resilience of the dominant classes was able to expand the hegemonic structure, make the right transition so that it could survive power. But so I think it would be interesting to explore, and I think what you wrote in the last chapter, maybe you could tell us, I mean, in your sense, what are the forces at work and what are the likely change in the world condition. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with Rajesh, who's going to speak about the international dimension.
Ambassador Pillai, Professor Mohan, and Dr. Akhtar, and distinguished guests. Let me begin by thanking ISAS for inviting me to air my views on this very interesting book. And of course, I must particularly thank Dr. Akhtar for stimulating me to think in a different way about Pakistan's foreign policy. When I began to read the book, I soon realized that this is not a work on Pakistan's foreign relations at all, but it's focused mainly on the complexities of its domestic politics, and in a form that is quite different from analyses such as in the recent volume on Pakistan's democratic transition, edited by Ishtaq Ahmad and Adnan Rafi. So I thought to myself, what am I going to speak about? Well, I will not elaborate on the well-known politics of the Kashmir dispute, India-Pakistan wars and crises, Pakistan's role in Washington's global war on terrorism, or its strategic links with China and the Middle East. In a sense, what I'm about to say tries to draw what might be said from the standpoint of Dr. Akhtar's analysis, but in a broad way. In line with my mandate, it will be a kind of extension of his analysis at the international realm, to the international realm, though whether he will agree with this or not, I'm not very sure. I'll soon find out. I apologize for reading from a text which I normally do not do, but this has been a tricky task for me since I'm on somewhat unfamiliar territory, and I wanted to make sure I don't actually wander off at a tangent. So, let me say at the outset that the reflections that follow, therefore, are preliminary, tentative, and since I began reading the book only 5 days ago, I have to be very careful what I say, because works of such complexity actually require rereadings and careful absorption and reflection before one can actually say something meaningful about it. So my apologies in advance for my limitations. Also, let me state upfront that my own work comes from an altogether different analytical stream that has over the years been built on an eclectic framework incorporating elements that are both materialist and ideational. But anyway, to my mind, there is a thread running through the book which is connected to the substantive foreign policy issues I mentioned earlier, and it is about two things. One, the state-building project and the linkage between the common sense of everyday politics in Pakistan and its external relationships. And two, Pakistan's position in the global economy and its related power structure, that is what I would venture to call the common sense of everyday international politics. Neither of these facets of Pakistan's place in international politics is inherently contradictory to the argument of the book. At least that is the way I see it, though the inferences I draw may be subject to debate. So let me turn to the first point, the state-building project and Pakistan's foreign policy and national security. I think one major point that comes out of Dr. Akhtar's analysis is through his central focus on, quote-unquote, the historic bloc, or what he calls the dominant coalition of interests, which shapes the domestic politics of Pakistan. The same bloc may reasonably be viewed as the fount of its external policies as well, as generally would be the case from this analytical perspective with other states too. the interests of this military-dominated historical bloc in what some have called a hybrid political system, that is, one in which the armed forces foreground a democratic constitution, control the framework of Pakistan's national security policy. I think that is the chief point that I would draw from his book. The prominence of the India factor as the quote-unquote unfinished business of partition centered on the Kashmir dispute has, over decades of war and crises, been set in stone as the foundation of Pakistan's foreign policy. The logic of Dr. Akhtar's argument, as I see it, is that the foundation is not as solid as it seems, since the political agenda is set by the same historic bloc, in which, in a Gramscian sense, the religious right and the intermediary classes have acquiesced. This raises a question mark over what is commonly held to be the core issue of Pakistan foreign policy. And as an Indian, I am somewhat conscious that I may be seen as being biased in this respect, but I also recognize the same sort of analysis could be made about India or about any country for that matter. But since that is the purpose here, to look at Pakistan's security and international relations, I confine myself to remarks about Pakistan. Besides, such apparently foundational features of the foreign policies of nations have in the past evaporated from political contestation. I think this point is important. The classic example is the Franco-German dispute over the territory of Alsace-Lorraine, over which three wars, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 and the two world wars, were fought, but which is no longer an issue between the two. So the question remains. So who stands to gain most from the persistence of the dispute? In the Pakistani case, it is perhaps the same historic bloc led by the military and those allied with it. As I said, let me reiterate, the logic could be applied to the Indian case as well, though, as Dr. Akhtar's analysis recognizes, the historic bloc is different in this context. I think the main point coming out of his analysis is to identify the political dynamic which entrenches the historic bloc in Pakistan. And my codicil to this, so to speak, is to extend his logic to Pakistan's external relations. In like way, other key features of Pakistan's foreign policy, the Cold War, post-Cold War linkages with the United States, China, Middle East, can be viewed in terms of the same question, who gains? And the answers from this perspective, no doubt with some qualifications, come back to the historical bloc which dominates Pakistani politics. In particular, as Dr. Akhtar briefly notes, the large infusions of cash that have come in by way of aid and investment have, apart from their other effects, enabled the historic bloc to sidestep serious domestic reform. One could, of course, come to a similar conclusion from the perspective of realist or liberal mainstream analysis, as has been done, for example, in work on the political dynamics underlying foreign aid. Let me turn to the second and more general point that I am making, which is to consider the larger global context in which Pakistani security is located and the ways in which it might be understood. In the orthodox Marxist view, the spread of capitalism sows the seeds of change through a dialectical process that weakens the structure of dominance. I think, apart from his revolutionary ideas, I think the more fundamental point that Marx is trying to make is that the spread of capitalism has this impact of transforming the global economy and, as a result, its politics. But neo-Marxian theorists subsequently argue that this structure is more resilient than Marx and Lenin expected because of the linkages between the sources of power in the center and those in the periphery. The Gramscian perspective visualized by Dr. Akhtar strengthens this point by highlighting that the dominant groups in the center where power is located are able to gain a significant degree of acquiescence from social groups in the periphery. The neoliberal conclusion that with the end of the Cold War we have reached the end of history in a Hegelian sense tends to mock the Marxian expectations of fundamental change. Well, Capitalism has demonstrated remarkable resilience, but it is as yet far from clear whether it is beginning to weaken with the onset of trade wars and systemic fragmentation, or whether this is just a passing phase and whether it will reinvent itself in ways that are still open to speculation. I think we are at an important point, at a sort of fork in the road, so to speak, for capitalism. And the question is, which way will it go? And either way, how will it affect Pakistan's external as well as internal future? I'm raising a point. I know I don't have the answers. I mean, I don't think I'm an expert economist in the first place, but I think it's something that we ought to think about. And my point here is that this is exactly what Dr. Akhtar's analysis makes us think when we extend it to the realm of foreign relations. I raise this point, therefore, because I see that at the end of his book, he is actually tempers what appears to be a pessimistic trend in his book with a degree of optimism. He is looking for signs of change. He talks on page 172 about the possible emergence of, quote unquote, a new political imaginary amid the continuing emergence of counter-hegemonic claims in the context of Gramsci's understanding that common sense will evolve. So the common sense that he talks about in most of the book, which is actually one which reinforces the existing structure of power, is actually something that is subject to change. My own sense was that perhaps Dr. Akhtar was not not optimistic enough to push at how this change might happen in the global structure. But anyway, the question, I'm just raising questions, I'm sorry. The question I would like to raise is about, about this, that can we think about where global economic and political structures are headed today? And depending on this, the different ways in which Pakistan's external relationships might be propelled, and parenthetically, how this in turn might impact on its domestic power politics and power structure. I suggest the penetration of capitalism might over time actually produce social change that undermines the current political structure in Pakistan. I don't do this from a Marxian perspective, because if you look at liberals' analysis, their expectation is the same, right? It's just, and I'm not going to commit to which form of analysis I'm looking at. I'm just raising this point that will the penetration, the deeper, ever deeper penetration of capitalism through the process we call globalization, will it actually have a transformative effect on Pakistan in the long run? Dr. Akhtar's position tends to be throughout the book that, well, there's a lot of resistance to change, but I tend to be, in the long run, and see, of course, in the long run, we are all dead, but that said, I still tend to be somewhat optimistic. On a more down-to-earth level, the massive impact of the rise of China may, through the China-Pakistan economic corridor, significantly alter the domestic political structures that set the frameworks of Pakistan's domestic and foreign policies. While one standpoint might stress that the historic bloc would tend to corner such dividends as accrue from Chinese mega investments, the sheer scale of the investment might well hasten the crumbling of the current political order over time, bringing in its wake major shifts in the external relations, in Pakistan's external relations, and indeed its understanding of national security. Sure, this is going to be a contested point, but I think we should talk about it, debate it, and make it worthwhile creative enterprise to contest it. So finally, I return to the point about global capitalism's current tensions. Right? We need to consider how Pakistan's economy might be affected by the present-day beggar-thy-neighbor trend in the global system, and whether there might yet, as a result, be a breakdown in the existing form of common sense prevailing in Pakistan, as a consequence of increasing pressures on it. So it could work that way too, that you get outside pressures becoming so powerful that in fact society begins to tend to weaken and crumble. The existing power structure in society tends to weaken and crumble from within. But then, once again, I have to admit I am not really competent to answer this. I'm good at raising questions, perhaps but not at answering them. I think Dr. Akhtar is competent, and it would be illuminating if he could expand his analysis to encompass the global dimension, to consider this perhaps in his next volume. Thank you.
So now we go back to Dr.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I think that what you noted is absolutely correct, and by design, that in focusing more on society and how it has changed and evolved, I chose not to write about the international dimension so much. I mean, it's there, as was just pointed out. I don't think it can be avoided, especially when you think through what is the so-called ideology of Pakistan, and the security orientation of the state. And this, not orientation is understating it. The obsession with security, the fact that national security trumps all other considerations. Obviously, that has much to do with external relations, and particularly India, as was pointed out. And India's centricism has, of course, guided much of state policy since the very beginning. And the dialectic between, that external dimension and domestic politics is clear. It accords the military a larger-than-life role because, as I pointed out, everybody else is, excuse the term, this is just a colloquial, standard colloquial usage in Pakistan. Everybody else is a bloody civilian. That plays out in domestic politics. I mean, if you look at the way the media projects the image of politics and politicians. In fact, there's a very interesting book, which everybody should read, by Ayub Khan's Director General of Public Relations, DG ISPR, under Ayub Khan, whose name was Brigadier A.R. Siddiqui. He wrote a book called The Pakistani Military Myth and Reality. And he wrote very clearly in the book that we spend a lot of time on PR and making sure that we remain holier than thou, and the politicians are bashed to no end for their inevitable and perennial failings. So all of that happens because there is this perennial enemy, and the enemy is always out to threaten our existence, right? The existential question trumps all other questions. So, that's not to suggest that these things are not related. It is just a choice in terms of what I figured is not talked about, because this has been talked about in the literature, and what hasn't been talked about is precisely what I thought needed to be emphasized. Having said that, I mean, I totally follow the point about the global story and what kind of pressures and what kind of dynamics that story might trigger, or sort of inadvertently what processes of change that might set into motion. Look, I mean, as far as the West is concerned, I think you made a very valid point. It's hot, cold, and over the last 17 years, do more hasn't triggered much at all. So that hasn't worked. China is a different story, because China's footprint is not just going to be strategic or on-off. It's a very permanent economic logic that China is introducing into the country. Now, can that trigger incipient forces of change? I mean, in principle, yes. I'm worried, but not because I'm a worrywart or I'm a pessimist, but because I see the CCTV cameras everywhere in Islamabad, and I worry that an already authoritarian polity will become even more so. And, you know, some of you will have seen the recent cover of The Economist, right, about the surveillance state and Xinjiang and so on. So I'm not certain. I mean, at least politically. Now, economically, which is sort of the long run sort of story that you're suggesting. My concern is that CPEC is not going to, despite all of the stuff about being a game changer and so on and so forth, I don't see it sort of creating millions of jobs or generating an economic logic that, you know, multiplier effects that then inadvertently perhaps lead to processes of change. I see it actually in some ways, and if you look at some of the statistics already, Pakistan's manufacturing industry has already been throttled by you know, low-cost Chinese manufacturers that have come into the country over the last 17, 18 years. And much domestic business is becoming extremely more comprador than it was when it was just Japanese Daihatsus and Western multinationals that were knocking on the door. So, not to say that it may not have other effects, but you know, there's a time, it's almost like a time bomb in Pakistan. We have an exceedingly young population, a huge youth bulge. About 65% of the population is under the age of 25. That's 150 million people. Okay? Hear it again, 150 million. Where are the jobs for these people? We have a plethora of private universities sprouting up across the country because there's a demand for degrees. But I have MPhil graduates who are selling corn on the cob on the street because there's no jobs, because there's no job creation. And I don't see, and the other thing with CPEC is, I went up to Mansehra some months ago where a big part of the road construction is taking place. And it was an entire colony of in-migrated Chinese workers. So locals were not getting the jobs. The construction, the engineers, the experts were all Chinese. So I'm not certain, and I think the way in which we tend to sell our soul to get these big contracts, where we say we sign away labor rights, we sign away domestic employment guarantees, you know, ecology, this is a classic one. You know, China has cut down on coal production, right, because its city air is all black. So we have a big electricity problem in Pakistan, right? So under the early harvest, or what's called the early harvest CPEC projects, there's 13,000 megawatts of power being generated on the grid. 12,500 of which, according to the CPEC's own long-term plan, are coal-fired. And, you know, Delhi and Lahore these days, the air cannot be breathed. So, you know, these are the sorts of short-sightedness that has always sort of, in some ways, characterized policy decisions that I don't see changing. So that is why I wouldn't count on that being. Now, for the record, I'm definitely an optimist, despite what the book might have suggested to you. So the optimism comes precisely because this exceedingly young population will have to be politicized. It can't afford to remain beholden to Zia era sort of politics is bad sort of rhetoric, because it is about their own futures. And there will, I think, there is a tipping point that we are reaching very soon, where you cannot continue to engage in this year-to-year, month-to-month, patronage-based decision-making, but something that has to be more long-term and address longer-term emergent challenges of education. And by the way, education is, as I pointed out, not just a challenge of the quantity of education, because so much of what goes by the name of education is stunts critical thinking rather than you know, sort of generates critical faculties. So it's education, employment, ecology, These are all very real emergent challenges over the next 25, 30 years. And going back to what you said, I think it will be a combination of a breakdown of elite consensus. I mean, Nawaz Sharif, like I said, biting the hand that once fed him is a classic example of a breakdown of elite consensus. But it can't just be that. It also has to be something to accompany that. Something to say, okay, well, this is the alternative. This is what we want to build in its place. We want peace with our neighbors, right? I don't want to spend the next 70 years saying, well, the only thing that matters in Pakistan is the fact that the country needs to exist and everything else is irrelevant. No, that's not true. We have to have a healthy, educated population. That's what's going to make us secure, not perennially going on about India eating us up alive. You know, we need to have peace with Afghanistan. There needs to be a politics that says all of these things, which, unfortunately, as you noted with the historical bloc, tends not to happen. Because on the one hand, you have a very powerful military, and then on the other hand, you have mainstream electoral parties which all have this perception, well, we have to toe the official line if we want to come to power. So no one is willing to say those difficult things that need to be said if you want to address some of these challenges. Now, let's look at Exhibit A, Imran Khan, who, up till 5 years, I don't know how this happened, your guess is as good as mine, who was the leader of the youth. I don't know what's youthful about him, but that's another matter. But there was a sense that, you know, okay, a new contender, someone who's not tainted, and, you know, inspiring young people and so on and so forth. And then 5 years or 10 years later, if you look around him, it's a large number of those same old politicians who jumped ship from an old party to join his party. And much of the sort of expectation or hope surrounding that political project has, I wouldn't say it's dissipated, but you know, there is a lot of cynicism about, well, how much change is this guy really going to be able to introduce? Which, quite aside from the fact that, as I mentioned at the outset, like, you know, this idea that a messiah can show up and fix everything is a bit misguided to begin with. So I think that there's a great deal of a trend. I mean, elections are coming up, and of course, in some ways, you know, beggars can't be choosers, so the very fact that we're having a third successive election without some kind of military intervention, at least formal military intervention, should count as progress. But that's pretty minuscule progress. And the longer term policy challenges are very much, you know, will remain and will continue to intensify. I think, if you ask me, I don't know how many of you have followed in recent times some of these emergent social movements like this movement around the Northwest and where much of the counter-terrorist operations have taken place. That for me is a sign that young people are no longer willing to just toe the official line. There are now ways and means for people to express their opinion. It's a dangerous business, no doubt. But you know, there are ways and means now to express opinions, and those opinions are not just random opinions. They address these significant policy issues: accountability, security. What does it mean to be a secure country? How do we deal with a phenomenon like terrorism, which, if you noted what I said earlier about Islam and religious groups, is not just some faraway phenomenon in some tribal agency, right? It's a question of how you know, sort of certain trends in society are deeply entrenched in the political sphere and otherwise. These are questions that people now want to talk about. Young people want to talk about. They want to have an opportunity to have their say. And they want both the unelected apparatus of the state to answer them, and hopefully also political parties to be able to respond to their demands. And I think that is a sign moving forward. So both the fact that the established elite, the historical bloc, is subject to a lot of internal contradiction, and the fact that there's a young, very young population, much of it has remained outside the realm of formal politics for much of their lives, but now I think are being compelled by one reason or the other to speak up. Now, that of course is not enough. It's not like we can have sort of be overly romantic about social media and technology being the answer. I think it's just a reflection that there is potential. I still think that what's missing in this equation is a coherent political project, that talks about all of these things in simple ways. Peace in the neighborhood, regional cooperation, a sustainable, ecologically sustainable development model, right? One of the big things in Pakistan, which I didn't get to mention, but is in the book, is that it's actually a very divided polity along ethnic lines. We often, because there's so much talk about Islam and a Muslim state, we neglect that it is a society in which ethnicity is very, very politicized. And there's this widespread perception, there has been for a long time, that outside of Punjab, everybody else is a second-class citizen. And there are demands and there are aspirations that are associated with those questions. These are all things that are out there in the public sphere. And whether they can come together in the form of a coherent political project, I think, is the challenge, is the question. I can't say when it might happen. I think I can say it will. I don't think it's a question of if. I think it's more a question of when. What does it look like? How does it come together? I think it will be on the basis of these social movements that emerge from time to time, on the basis of genuine grievances of various kinds, and they then, over time, perhaps take the shape of a more coherent, organized political project. In the final analysis, I would say that the only thing that I would be worried about, the only pessimism I would have is, and this is something that I observe as a global phenomenon, when you look at especially the rise of right-wing populism around the world, everywhere, west, east, wherever you see it. There are genuine crises that states and societies are facing. Many of them are economic, some of them are about representation and politics, and there is a sense that one of the major responses is a very right-wing xenophobic response. Blame the other, blame the outsider. And we've had our fair share of that in Pakistan from the word go. So that is also a potential, is one way where this exceedingly young and possibly frustrated population could look, if there are no progressive alternatives that take shape. That's a note of caution. Not necessarily to say that's the only thing, because that's been, in fact, what has happened over time. So I'm saying that the optimism is that you'd expect a break from that, because that's never worked. That doesn't work. Blaming the other or the outsider, saying we are constantly besieged and let's beef up our security or so on accordingly. I can't say that these are things that we can guarantee. And of course, there's much in the way of that historical bloc or the military-dominated coalition that one would be concerned about, that would sort of inhibit the possibilities of something different and progressive emerging. But let's just say, amongst circles, who are politically active, as I have been for many years, there is also cause for cautious optimism in recent times, and I suspect that particularly the youth card. Mind you, for instance, there's 18 million new voters this election. 18 million people between the ages of 18 and 25 who've never voted before. Now, they won't necessarily be beholden to those old established patronage ties. They may be, but they may also may not be. They may vote for an idea. The problem is that there's no fresh idea out there. Not that they wouldn't vote for it. So in that sense, I think there is potential for change, and I think the question is whether something can, in that very high threshold where we see it emerge, a new form of politics emerging. I think that's what we have to look at, and of course that entails all of us, at least those who have a stake in Pakistan, to not reproduce that politics passion, which has been one of the features of what the Zia regime did. And I think I often find that amongst educated segments of the population, that they also bash politics. They also bash politicians. They sort of reproduce that logic. And that I think is something that is worth bearing in mind, which has many parallels to, I think, the Indian case as well, right? A relatively upwardly mobile, educated middle class, which looks at the Lalu Prasads of the world and says, how could some, these sorts of people come into power, sort of thing. And that, of course, is what democratic politics is about. And I think that at an ideological level is, I think, something that is a challenge moving forward, especially with the corporate media and the way in which the Pakistani polity is constructed. But as I said, there are young people, there's lots of spaces within which alternative narratives are emerging. And I am hopeful that some of those narratives will grow into something substantial.
Since you could ask you so much, maybe that you need optimism of the will and pessimism of the mind. So I think in the end, I think if you're actually involved in practice, I think optimism is critical. To be able to remain hopeful and to be able to see some of the changes that are taking place. But I had just one question to both of you, and then we will open up the floor for discussion. It's about the role of the Gulf and the Middle East more broadly in this. Because I think the Middle East connection, the Middle East, I was talking about the importance of Gulf and the Middle East for Pakistan's domestic politics. At least at three levels where the Middle East and the Gulf especially matter so much. One, on the question of Islam, that actually historically, even before independence, the looking towards the Middle East, the question of the Khilafat movement or relative movement that took place, the whole question of what happens in the Middle East was deeply connected to India, and I think much of India's own politics was deeply tied to what is going on in the Middle East. So therefore, the Middle East is quite a central thing, I think, in the evolution of modern subcontinent. But it operates at three levels. One is the religion issue. That conservatism, the triumph of the conservatives in the '68 summit, the weakening of the secular nationalist forces of the Baath Party of Egyptian nationalists and the rise of that had a direct impact on Pakistan and India to some extent. So therefore, today my question is in relation to Islam. And I think we've also seen a Saudi plane waiting on the tarmac to push Nawaz Sharif, who just arrived there, into the plane and flying back to Saudi Arabia. The kind of daily influence in the Saudi, the Middle East countries, in the politics of Pakistan is so obvious, and I think in terms of. But today, at the level of economics, you said the Gulf gave a big, pushed South Asia into economic crisis because oil prices shot up in the late 70s. But at the same time, it opened the door for a massive labor exports from South Asia to the Gulf. So in some senses, it did both the things. But today, if there is a downturn in the Gulf, what does it do to the Pakistani economy? Because both for India too, it's going to be a big question. The the assumption the Gulf is going to be on a permanent boom, and that is going to produce benefits for us. I mean, so that problem is the oil price down is good, but oil price down also means the Gulf boom at some point will come to an end, and what does it do to our economy? So that's in terms of the potential trigger change in Pakistan. Second, that if conservative Islam coincide in the Middle East coincided with the rise of conservative Islam in more broadly conservative religious sentiments in South Asia. Today, the reform movements, such as they are in Saudi Arabia, where of course it's top down, where the crown prince is doing things which were unimaginable till 2 years ago, quite significant. And I think in terms of whether you have to take a value judgment on it, but the fact that the leadership is trying to do things which were, whether it's not merely licenses, driving license for women, the question of cinema theatres, a whole lot of interesting things that are beginning to happen. It's also very interesting that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Sultan talked about 1979 was the problem. 79, Iranian Revolution, Russian occupation of Afghanistan. 79 changed everything. We were different before 79. You could say the same thing about South Asia, not just Pakistan. We were a different world before 79. 79 changed everything. But tomorrow, if there is reform in Saudi Arabia, if there is, in Iran too, I think sporadic attempts at challenging the Vilayat al-Faqih of the ruling regime, very interesting things have happened. We've been taking doing things in the last few years. Last few months, actually, the protests against the economic crisis in Iran is creating very interesting consequences. So does that make a difference to the religious arguments that would reform in the Middle East have a positive effect, just as a regression in the Middle East had a negative effect? Would reform and positive change lead to positive things in South Asia? So on economics and on the religion question, but more largely that the Middle East that begins to modernize and looks at the world from a different perspective of security. Today, kind of things Indian and Pakistan armies do today, UAE doesn't. Right now you can see what's going on in Yemen. The kind of things the Pakistan army used to do today, the Saudis are doing it, the UAE is doing it. So the military role of Pakistan in the Gulf was a major thing. Today, the Saudis, they're today in a position where they're doing the interventions in a way that unimaginable in some people. But put simply, does Middle East have an effect on the evolution of Pakistan?
I think you make a very perceptive point that there are two linkages which are somewhat weakening maybe between Pakistan and the Middle East. One is with regard to religion and the other is economic. I think the point about religion is important, and you could say that developments in the Middle East will make looking west from Pakistan less inspirational, shall we say? And no, inspirational in the sense of the encouragement of the radical values, including the flow of cash, by the way. But I'm not so sure that that alone. I mean that the flow of cash and that inspiration was at a certain point of time. That maybe that flow no longer matters as much as it did then. It really gave a push to radicalism. But radicalism is established now in Pakistan, and really the danger is that Pakistan itself would become a major center for that kind of radicalism, even if its links are with the Middle East are cut off. It's a possibility that at least needs to be taken into account. As far as the economics of it is concerned, I think it's important to recognize that the Saudis are also undertaking changes in their economic structure or organization, to the extent they are aware that oil is not what it used to be as the predominant and dynamic feature of their economy, and that there has been a trend in the last year or two to actually divest the usage of foreign labor to keep the economy running, and therefore the prospect of remittances and as a major source of income, as well as the Middle Eastern economies as a major source of employment is steadily beginning to show signs of weakening. So that actually brings back the question that I raised earlier, and which Dr. Akhtar did actually respond to about the CPEC, for example, and so on. I think, Dr. Akhtar, you mentioned that the prospects of CPEC transforming Pakistan in a positive way are actually not that great as they might appear to be, at least from government handouts. But my point is really that we need to look at what are the forces which could transform Pakistan one way or the other. So if CPEC doesn't work, and already people are using words like neo-colonialism in Pakistan, as they are in Sri Lanka and other places, you could actually see the pressures on the state and its existing power structure, and indeed on this whole common sense that prevails today, actually intensifying. I mean, it could well be, and it's likely that things will get a lot worse before things really reach a tipping point in that sense. But where it is going, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, just to back up that point, Saudi Arabia has actually started deporting Pakistani workers in big numbers. So the Gulf has a sort of a reliable staging ground to send out unskilled workers. I think those days, we're on the downside of that curve now. Which then just basically to reiterate that earlier point, that the kinds of employment needs we have, that just simply exacerbates what we already are confronted with. More generally, this question of conservative or even militant ideologies, I tend to agree with that. I think that Iran, Saudi Arabia, that has always been sort of a proxy war that's played out in Pakistan. Sectarianism has had a major external dimension. But there is a sense, as you pointed out, that this now sort of domestic roots have been established. And my worry is that, irrespective of what may happen in Iran or Saudi Arabia or the Gulf more generally, my worry is that, and this is something that I think will inhibit reform processes in those countries as well, is that when you historically, as state policy, have used religion as a political weapon, then there is a disincentive for those factions of the elite that have done this historically to stop it, quite frankly, to put it in simple terms. Until and unless they can find some other incentive to stop doing it. It could be force. I mean, I was talking to someone recently about, the extent to which China might exert pressure on Pakistan to stop some of its good Taliban, bad Taliban, dichotomy type stuff. And that may happen, but, the question is whether there is a domestic constituency that continues to benefit from this. And if it does, I don't think external pressure or external forces are sufficient for it to shift substantially. And those of you who are familiar, the Faizabad Dharna is Exhibit B. Exhibit A I already mentioned earlier, Exhibit B. Now that's an interesting phenomenon, right? Because for most of from the late 1970s, again, those of you familiar with this terminology, it was Deobandi and Ahle Hadith groups that were patronized. But this Khadim Rizvi character is a Brahmi. And so now you have this new brand of militancy, which is Brahmi militancy. And back in the day, this was unimaginable. Because the whole idea was that Brahmins are peace-loving and so on and so forth, and etc., etc. But you have this guy who shows up and blocks the capital city for 30 days, and everybody knows that that can only happen if it's allowed to happen. And then when it ended, there was this rather farcical situation where some guy in uniform was handing out 1,500 rupees to each of them to go and take a bus home, as if any more evidence was needed. So, my sense is that, yes, I follow your point. I think that could have an impact, but so long as there's a domestic constituency that chooses to continue doing this for one reason or the other, whether it's because they think that it serves foreign policy objectives, or whether it's because it helps to blunt domestic opposition, which both have gone hand in hand for the last many decades. That is what I think will be crucial. And again, that is where I think it is a question of the dynamics within that will determine what happens going forward.
We have time for a few questions, so please, I'll take 3 questions in the first round, then see if you have time, we can take more. The lady there, please.
Hi, representing the assignments. Just curious, any further advice for companies looking and wanting to venture into Pakistan's national securities market? Yeah, just very curious about that. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Wait, go ahead. Yeah.
Awesome, thanks very much for the talk. I look forward to reading the book. The question I had was about how the PTI is clearly being backed by the military in this sort of soft coup or soft military intervention you alluded to. And this, in line with what you just described, raises 2 points to me which look like they're going to be a point of crisis in the near future. One is that the PTI-backed coalition, which has accumulated all the usual suspects, won't be elected. That would be a shock. This is a time of shock elections, so it's an entertaining possibility, but a point of crisis nonetheless. And the second is that they are elected, as you might expect, but their brand of governance, of the historical bloc, is sort of a proven failure in delivering the health and education that the youth bulge and others want. So, is this one? Is that a fair reading of the argument that you're making, and 2, how might you see that playing out?
Hello, Professor. So just to briefly point out where I'm coming from, my PhD research focuses on Indian common sense, so I'm naturally very curious. Methodologically, how do you recover this Pakistani common sense and the contestation around it? Is it a political economic approach, or is it discourse analytic? If you could answer that question. Thank you.
As for the securities market, I don't really specialize in that kind of security. So I can't help you a great deal. But I will say this, it's interesting, this may not interest you, but might interest others. It's telling that much of the discourse around terrorism, for instance, in Pakistan, often focuses on this question of we need to get rid of it because that's the only way we will get foreign investment into the country. Not because we want peace, or it's a bad thing that people die, but because we want foreign investment to come into the country. So it is sort of reflective of this somewhat instrumental and futile approach, which is we want this to happen, yes, we want capital to come in and we want people to invest, but with a very superficial sort of recognition of what needs to happen to make that possible as more of a long-run thing. And CPEC is an interesting example of that, where there's so many concerns about security. And in trying to address those security concerns to make CPEC investments safe, you end up reinforcing some of the bad old problems of authoritarianism, right? So you end up reinforcing sort of the problem. This question of what could happen, yes, I think both are possible. I definitely think that there is a bit of unpredictability about what might happen in the election. Nawaz Sharif has played the victim card to an extent and might just actually benefit from doing so, which would be a surprise, but also not at some level. That would also trigger a problem because they don't want him back in power. But I think the way in which that sort of outcome would work is little brother would come into power. And little brother is generally considered to be much less confrontational. So that is the way in which a certain compromise would work. The other is that Imran comes into power, and then we have our Erdogan moment, where he facilitates a widespread clampdown on dissent, which I think he would do quite happily. But in both scenarios, let me suggest, I think that sooner or later, precisely because structural crises remain unaddressed, that like every other elected regime in Pakistan's history, within, if not a few short months, then within a year or two, the leg pulling will start, and conflicts will emerge. And one of the reasons why Imran may not, even in their preferred outcome, may not be the candidate of choice is because there is a sense that he's a bit of a loose cannon. So you can't rely on him to just toe the line always, and he may do something that is way out of left field. So either way, I think that will, because I don't see either, even if the Noon League comes back into power, I don't see them addressing some of these structural crises, whether because they don't want to or because they can't. And the PTI, I don't see it doing it either, so I do see them at the level of society, and then with the powers that be from behind the scenes, I see sort of more of the same playing out. The last thing is, I've lived and worked in Pakistan for 19 years, and I've been politically active for most of it. So, let's say participant observation.
Okay, we can take another set of questions. Yes?
Yes, my name is Anish Mishra. Firstly, I would like to start by recognizing some of the positive steps Pakistan has taken towards the development of a democracy, such as the National Assembly has completed its term for the second time. Even before the last days, the House was very much active and all that. But I would like your view on the doctrine of necessity, and the reason the reason for this is that whatever you write in the Constitution, with the doctrine of necessity, which states that which is not legal, necessity can make legal. I mean, do you think that this doctrine of necessity is dead, or you can very much, or you can come back to life? And my view on this is that although Miyazaki Nisar has said that the doctrine of necessity is dead.
It's a good question. So I think the judiciary.
Yes.
So let's.
Can I complete the question? Yeah, although Miyazaki Nisar has said that the doctrine of necessity is dead, but until no one is punished under Article 6 of the Constitution, I don't think this doctrine of necessity will ever be dead. And the next point I want to make, just a very quick one, I would like to know your view on the death of ideological politics in Pakistan, because today there's no more ideological politics in Pakistan. The purpose of politics is just to gain seats. It's all about power. No more ideological politics is gone. So I like your view on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Deepinder?
Thank you. Really looking forward to reading the book. I must confess at the very outset I'm quite ignorant, but I was struck by something that you said earlier in your talk, and that is there's a very cliched hackneyed representation of Pakistan as a feudal society. It's a society, an economy that's been in considerable flux, and you spoke of the emergence of a mercantilist class that is occupying a different space as well, and inequalities. Could you shed a little more light on what's the manifestations, other than the Sharif family, and how they interplay into culture as well. The second question was, it's reassuring to see your optimism about the 150 million people, youth, who are going to be entering the workforce, but unfortunately there don't seem to be any jobs for them. It's the same situation across the border. I mean, you just have to multiply that by a factor of 4. And I was reminded of what happened in Tunisia almost a decade ago at the start of the Arab Spring. People talk about a fight for democracy and rights, but the initial the tender, as it were, was actually the fact that Tunisia had been remarkably successful in educating its youth. A large cohort had gone to university, but there were no jobs. And the disenchantment that created led to the civil strife. Now, you articulated some optimism, I'm sorry, I'm taking too much time, about the 150 million youth, and they augur well for the future. Could you again elaborate a bit on where do you think these energies are going to be directed, and how, I mean, if any manifestations of them? Thank you.
I'm going to just start the third question. You had a question? Please, go ahead.
My name is Sunil Guliani. My question is a very light one. In Punjab, I'm told officially you cannot speak Punjabi. Is that the official version? That people are prohibited from speaking Punjabi? They must speak Urdu? Some elaboration.
God forbid.
I think we got good questions on the judiciary, the language.
Yeah. Look, the doctrine of necessity is an interesting one, right? Because when Sharaf was being deposed, as many of you will remember, there was a big popular sort of political movement around the question of, well, is extra-legal, imposition of martial law and sacking the Chief Justice. And so there was a whole movement around the question of law and legality and the rule of law. And after that, there was a period, there has been successive Supreme Courts that have been extremely activist around the, building on the momentum that was generated, as was the media, which also depicted itself as extremely free and committed to democracy and the rule of law. And retrospectively, it's a bit it's a bit Orwellian, really, because the same two institutions, the media and the judiciary, have, while continuing to be claiming to have buried the doctrine of necessity, in fact, it's been the Supreme Court that has now sacked 2 successive prime ministers. Right? Yusuf Raza Gilani in 2012 and Nawaz Sharif last year. Quite irrespective of what anyone might feel about their credentials or not, it means that you've set up, in some ways, a new institutional mechanism to take, so to speak, legalize certain, in some ways, anti-democratic steps, because this is, the elected leader of the National Assembly being disqualified on the basis of, again, a Zia-era amendment, Article 61 and 62, which is about morality and being Islamic enough to be an elected leader. So that, in some ways, is the doctrine of necessity rearing its head in a sort of a novel way. And, needless to say, not to suggest that the Supreme Court has not previously, because it's the doctrine of necessity, of course, the doctrine of what was called revolutionary necessity, which was initially invoked in 1958 after the Ayub coup by then Chief Justice Munir. So this is just a new manifestation of an old methodology, where you're not having a general come in and take over power directly, but you are weakening or undermining an elected government through, so to speak, legal means. The question that you had, a great example of an emergent sort of this emergent commercial segment is is this guy Malik Riaz. So Malik Riaz is of Beria Town fame. Now, Beria Town is this huge, massive real estate developer, which has, in the last 15 or 20 years, created these massive gated communities all over the country, in and around big cities. And this guy was a small-time commercial operator. He's not rich from behind. He had no major political connections. He's a savvy economic entrepreneur who cultivated big links with powerful people. And in doing so, he also cultivated big links with powerful political figures. And the Beria means navy. So most of the big housing schemes in Pakistan are all around army run or have some connection. There's the defense housing authorities, there's Beria towns, there's Air Force schemes and so on and so forth. And he's a classic example, shot up through the ranks on the basis of political connections and is now the biggest real estate mogul in the country. And there are many others, transporters, traders, now real estate developers is big business, and they start off. They're basically what they know how to do is to cultivate these connections in the right places, and thereby develop their economic interests accordingly. And it's in the book, and hopefully you get a better sense of it. It started off more with, as I said, the secondary and tertiary sectors of the agrarian economy. So small market towns developing around areas where agriculture was being mechanized. And then, anyone from a tractor trolley repairman to someone who had a small plot of land and sent his son away to Dubai, who earned a lot of money, and he came and set up a shop. And then there's another guy who used to live where my grandparents lived in Rawalpindi, who set up something called Saber Foods, which is now the biggest pulao selling shop in Islam. And he had a small little tela on the road about 40 years ago. And now he's a huge... So there's all of these types of individuals. Sorry, the second question was about the youth bulge and so on. I teach at a public university. And I get students from all over the country. It's a federal university, so we get quotas from different ethnic communities. And these kids are not book smart because they come from a very poor public education system, but they're extremely street smart. So they can't tell you what Hobbes and Locke say about the state, but they know how thanas and kacheris work. And there's underlying discontent about the system. They seek access to the system. They all want to do the civil service exam. But they know that 97% of people who stand for the civil service exam fail. So they're always, on the brink of wanting to access the system, but always being resentful against the fact that the system does not accommodate all of them. And they're quite politicized. But again, they don't have avenues to express that. And as I mentioned to you just now, 6 months ago, a target killing of a young Pashtun boy in Karachi triggered this massive uprising against the excesses of counterterrorism operations in Pashtun. And all of my Pashtun students and Pashtun students over all university campuses, it's a new kind of political mobilization. Like what they do is, they have no organization, they have nothing. They all take their smartphones and an internet connection and live stream. And they've completely overtaken, they're trending on Twitter all the time. And they've taken the government, well, not the government, the real government, by storm. Having said that, of course, the Arab Spring 10 years later has not necessarily had great, outcomes down the line, which is why I think, those social movements in and of themselves are not sufficient. I think a coherent political project with a more longer-term structural sort of vision is essential. God forbid, there's no such, I have no such stipulation or or ban on speaking, but you mean in official circles? Is that what you were asking about? Yeah, no, not that I know. I've heard of no such. That might just be one of those, the fake news thing happening.
Too big and too global, Punjabi can't be killed by anyone.
Having said that, it is worth bearing in mind that the Punjabi middle class, urban middle class, is not very supportive of its own language. It tends to speak Urdu rather than Punjabi. Sindhis will speak Sindhi, Pashtuns will speak Pashto, Baloch will speak Balochi, Punjabis will speak Urdu. So that's a longer term historical question of why that happened from the colonial period, but no official ban.
Thanks. I think we have to bring this to a close. I thought just there's one question I wanted to pose to you before we close this. If you look at the book, it's got a lovely picture on top, and there is a slogan that is written in kind of in clear terms, but I don't understand the language. But what it says is "Siyasat nahi, riyasat bachao." That is, no politics save the state. And or if you say it in Punjabi, riyasat nahi, siyasat bachao. Or the other way around. But so, what does it mean? Can you tell our audience? Why did we put this on top? Why is it so?
You know, this long-term project of politicizing religion, one of the iterations was this Canadian import, Tairul Qadri. So Tairul Qadri, as you know, gets imported into Pakistan every 8 to 10 months from Canada. And he does these spectacular sort of disruptions of the public peace. And his slogan, this was his slogan, "Siyasat nahi riyasat bachao," i.e., we don't want politics, we want to save the state. Now guess who's saying that? So this is where it came from, and you know, it's just it's illustrative of what we've been talking about. Sort of this notion that we can't afford democracy, we can't afford politics, we can't afford these things because the only thing that matters is saving the state, and that's what we've been doing for 70 years, and you know how successfully we've been doing that.
Just actually raise an aspect which has not actually been discussed at all, and that is about the state of the Pakistan economy. And what I read, the Pakistani currency is in some trouble, losing value quite rapidly. I also know that there is increasing debt, national debt is very high, the balance of payments problem is significant, and dependence on the IMF. And that is increasing, and that in the context that the US has been putting pressure on Pakistan, it could also reflect in greater pressure from that standpoint. And so it seems to imply that Pakistan will become more and more dependent on China for its financial help, and how far the Chinese will let that happen is not very clear, is it?
Well, just very briefly, those of you who follow should read Khurram Hussain's work on this. He's a good friend and a great investigative journalist for Dawn, which is where also I write. And he's done a lot of in-depth studies. CPEC has been clouded in a lot of secrecy. It's a game changer. It's a game changer. Everybody says, but we never get any stats to bear that out or any figures. So Khurram did a lot of difficult and impressive work. And if you look at some of the figures that he's calculated, frankly, Chinese aid will generate pretty much as much debt as the multilateral aid package that we've gotten over the last many decades. So it's more of the same in that sense, in terms of the fact that debt is about 90 billion now. Between debt and debt servicing and defense, and then government overheads, that's about 88% of our budget. So you're absolutely correct, but these are, again, long-term structural problems that have existed for a long time. And it's not rocket science. And that's what requires the vision for people to be able to talk about these things and discuss them, and not just say, oh, everything's going to be A-okay now because the Chinese, because, our friendship is higher than the mountains and deeper than the sea.
So it's
Sweeter than honey, sorry.
So we have to really bring this to a close just when we are getting into strike, but please join me in giving a hand to So one small ritual to be done, and after that we'll go out for tea.
Thank you, Professor Mohan and distinguished panelists. I would like to now invite Professor Mohan to present a token of appreciation to our invited guest speaker, Professor Rajesh Basrur. With that, we have come to the end of the ISAS book launch and panel discussion. We'd like to invite you now for a tea reception outside the foyer. We thank you for your participation and we hope to see you at the next ISAS event. Have a good evening. Thank you.